Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a special edition of Story Hour in the Library. Tonight featuring, as we all know, Khaled Hosseini, and who will be in conversation with Elizabeth Farnsworth. I'm Dave Dewar. I'm the development director for the library on the Berkeley campus, and it's always a pleasure to see so many library supporters here in a room, and I appreciate your coming. I wanted you to note in the program, there's a little clever saying that the TV shows do, where this will be presented without commercial interruption, which indeed is the case tonight. But in order to make sure that we do that, I need to give you a very brief commercial. On the inside of the program, it talks about the University Library. We have a campaign right now that has twofold purpose. Many of you have supported one of the purposes, which is our collections. This is probably one of the strongest university library collections really in the world for its breadth and depth. And so one of the priorities for our campaign is support for those collections once again. But the new piece is the Moffett Library, which is our undergraduate library, and we are, after 40 years, and if the colors harvest, gold, or avocado mean anything to you, you will recognize the space that is still the Moffett Library, but we are doing a renovation of that library to address the student instructional and research needs, undergraduate students, for the next, well, we hope at least 40 years. I would like to ask you that we will have some time for questions, I believe, at the end, and so we'll just take them as they come. Anyway, I would like to introduce Vikram Chandra, who is the co-host of Story Hour. He's a renowned novelist and also a member of the Berkeley faculty in English, and he will introduce the program. Vikram.
Thank you all for coming. As David said, this is a very special Story Hour event. Story Hour is a monthly reading series which features appearances by writers of fiction and literary nonfiction here in the library. Our students and other members of our community benefit hugely from this face-to-face interaction with people who create literature, as Khaled does. And we couldn't do it without the continued support of the UC Berkeley Library. Our readers over the last 3 years have included Michael Chabon, Judith Freeman, Dave Eggers, Annie Barrow, Daniel Handler, Mary Roach, and many others. If you'd like, you can find us at storyhour.berkeley.edu, and we'll soon have an announcement for the next year's lineup of writers, and we're also on Facebook. Most of you will need no introduction to Elizabeth Farnsworth, so I'll keep this short. She covered foreign affairs and the arts for NewsHour on PBS for many years. She left the full-time staff in 2004 and continues to report as a special correspondent. She is currently the CEO of West Wind Productions, which most recently produced a feature-length documentary called The Judge and the General, which is about a Chilean judge investigating the charges of torture and murder against General Pinochet. The film was nominated for an Emmy and won a Directors Guild of America award. And recently, in January, it was awarded the DuPont Columbia Award, which is given by Columbia, and is quite literally the Pulitzer for television. So congratulations. Elizabeth has covered international events from all over the world. Her reporting on the AIDS crisis in Africa received an Emmy nomination and a 2001 Silver World Medal from the New York Festival. Her writings have appeared in Foreign Policy, World Policy Journal, the San Francisco Chronicle, The Nation, and many other publications. We're thrilled to have her here today. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Farnsworth.
Thank you so much, Vikram. And I want to thank Tom Leonard and Beverly Ingram and Dave Dewar for giving me this great opportunity. You can imagine you all are probably library users as I am. It's a great opportunity and an honor to be able to give back to this library, which has given me so much in the years that I've used it. I think the first time I used it was in 1970. I was translating with some other people for a local journal, the the program of government of Salvador Allende in Chile and annotating it. And we needed old Chilean newspapers. And of course, they were upstairs on microfiche, and I spent a lot of time here. But I have found in this library, I made a documentary about a small village in Vietnam, and I have found things about that village that you just can't believe that they would be present in this country. And so I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to be here, and I feel I'm almost on hallowed ground. I'm also glad to be able to interview Khaled Hosseini, whom I have known off and on, and whose novels, The Kite Runner and 1,000 Splendid Suns, with their narratives of lies, betrayals, secrets, and shame, grabbed my imagination and never really let go since. In this story hour, I love the title, I think that Khaled is a perfect person to be interviewing. We're going to learn more about the drama of his life, which is a narrative that also grabbed my imagination, but here are some basic facts before we start. Khaled Hosseini was born in Kabul, Afghanistan in 1965, where he lived most of the time until he was 11. His father was a diplomat, and he also lived in Tehran and Paris. In 1980, after the Soviet army invaded Afghanistan, the family decided they couldn't return home and sought and were granted political asylum in the United States. They've lived in San Jose ever since. Khaled attended high school there and graduated from Santa Clara University. He got a medical degree from UC San Diego's School of Medicine in 1993, completed his residency at Cedars-Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles, and was a practicing internist between 1996 and 2004. While working full-time as a physician, he wrote The Kite Runner. We'll ask him how in the world he managed to do that. He was writing at 9/11, but it wasn't published until 2003, and a lot of people all over the country lost a lot of sleep because they couldn't put it down no matter what was happening at the office the next day. As of today, approximately 22 million copies of The Kite Runner have been sold. I know this as of today because I heard from his agent today with the latest figure. In 70 countries, 6.8 million of them in the United States. In 2006, Khaled was named a Goodwill Envoy by the UN High Commission for Refugees, the UN Refugee Agency. His second novel, 1,000 Splendid Suns, was published in May 2007, and as of today has sold 10 million copies in 60 countries, 3.4 million in the United States. Khaled has also been working to provide humanitarian assistance to the people of Afghanistan through the Khaled Hosseini Foundation, which you have information about, and we'll hear more about that and see a video about his work in Afghanistan later in our talk. He's just moved to a new home in San Jose with his wife, Roya, and 2 children. Please join me in welcoming Khaled Hosseini.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're
Thanks
welcome.
for being here.
You're welcome. We actually have the strange distinction of having been sold together at another fundraiser, so that's where we met. We're the victims of human trafficking. Khaled, describe your life as a young reader in Kabul. Who, what, and where would you read?
I read anything I could get my hands on. The selection wasn't as widespread or as eclectic as it is in this library. But I grew up around classic Persian literature because that was the love of my parents. They grew up with classic Persian poetry, and so that was around all the time, sort of in the atmosphere. So I
and you
grew up
spoke
with that.
and read Dari, which is
Yeah,
Farsi.
I grew up speaking Dari or Farsi.
Which is...
I went to school, and that was my mother tongue. And in fact, there's a little game in the Kite Runner that the boys play in school where it's called the Battle of the Poems, the Sher Jangi, where basically you have one kid, you have 2 teams of children. One recites a verse from a poem, and it ends with a certain letter, and the other team has to recite another verse from another poem that begins with that letter, and go back and forth. And I remember, and my memory is shot now, but I was pretty good at it, and everybody wanted me on their team. But I read also at a local bookstore, like Farsi translations of anything, and you could, the shelf would be packed with, and there's a translation of a James Bond novel by Ian Fleming, and right next to it is Treasure Island, and right next to that is, I don't know, for all I know, Marcel Proust or something, So I picked up whatever was there, and I read so many of the books that I ended up loving later, like some Ernest Hemingway, some of the classic children's stories. I read them in Farsi, and then read them in their, quote, native language much later in my life.
Your mother was a professor of literature, right?
Yeah, my mother taught Farsi, and she taught Farsi and history at the largest high school for girls at the time in Kabul. She eventually became the vice principal. I had an aunt who taught literature at the university, and my father was a diplomat.
Tell us about your love for the great Persian masterpiece. It's called the Shahnameh, but the story of Rostam and Sohrab.
Yeah.
If anybody remembers from the novel, it figures in the Kite Runner, and it figures largely in your life. You've actually written a screenplay about Rostam and Sohrab.
So I grew up with this sort of the magnum opus. This is a terrible comparison, but it is to Persian literature what the Iliad is to Western literature. I mean, it's the great epic of the ancient Persian kings, and it's this great mythical story begins with the dawn of time and ends with the Arab invasion of Persia. And it has like 500 characters, and it has demons and dragons and all sorts of wonderful things. The most famous story in this enormous work is the story of Rostam and Sohrab, which is the story of a father and son who've never met, and who are great warriors who end up on opposite sides of an army and end up meeting on the battlefield. There's this climatic tragedy on the battlefield where the father unwittingly slays his son, and then as the son is dying, reveals his identity to the father, and it's one of the great tragic moments in Persian literature where the father realizes what he's done, and he tears his hair out and so on and so forth. But I love that story from a very young age, and when I wrote The Kite Runner, which really was, at its heart, was really a father-son story, which seems to it seems to have this magnetic pull on me as a writer. It's a theme that I revisit over and over and over and over again in one way or another. Family stories, but especially father-son stories. I just couldn't resist it because it was just there was so many parallels with this story in my book. Here's this enormous father character, Baba, who's this powerful, well-respected man that at some point Amir even describes as this great warrior, and then here's this boy who's trying to measure up to his father, who's trying to make his father proud. And I felt there were so many parallels, and thematically it was just the right touch. And I really wanted to get the Shahnameh in because I feel like it's this great tragedy that the Western world doesn't know about it. And that was the reason why I decided to write a screenplay about the Shahnameh, and I took some liberties with the story because the story is actually quite short. And I wrote this screenplay with a friend of mine over a span of 2 years, sent it to Hollywood. There was a lot of excitement about it, and people all loved it. Actually, we heard back from everybody from Steven Spielberg to all kinds of people who they read it and they actually really loved it. But they said, there's not a built-in audience like there was for Watchmen or 300. Nobody knows the Shahnameh, so we make this $200 million movie, and it's sort of the reality of what today's economy, what the reality of filmmaking is, unfortunately.
I'm going to come back to The Kite Runner at more length, but while we're on the current moment, and are you working on another screenplay right now? I'm
working on another screenplay, which, and I swear I didn't intend it to, but it's turning into another father-son thing. But this one is set in present day. In present day, it's a very, very simple story in the sense that it's not this epic like the Shahnameh, but it's this rather intimate story about this guy who has this small miracle happen in his life where he thinks he has found his son who died actually when he was 8, and it's the fallout from this kind of impossible situation. It's not a thriller, there's not like this story about doppelgangers, that kind of thing, but it really is about the power of sorrow, the power of guilt, the power of the pull of loving somebody, missing them so much, and what it can do to a person's perception of reality. So as I was writing it with this friend of mine, and there was always like these little sidetracks we could go on, and it would become slightly Stephen Kingish. And then we would say, okay, we have to stop. What would the French do? What would the French do? Think French. And so, imagine we're Godard or somebody and proceed that way. But we finished the first draft the other day. My friend's coming over on Thursday, and we're going to start editing it.
So you're doing this instead of writing another novel?
No, I'm doing it as I'm writing another book.
Oh, that too.
No, I'm writing another book. This is my little side thing.
Uh-huh.
So,
can you tell us anything about the novel?
I didn't say it was a novel, but I'm writing another book. It began as a novel. It's becoming more like a collection of short stories, because I began writing a novel which was set in Afghanistan, but I really wanted to do something entirely different, and I had all these ideas for it, and all these different characters, and all these different things I wanted to do, and I was jamming them all into this box. And at some point I realized this box is overflowing, and maybe what I should do is just take these things out and give them a life of their own, each individual one, and maybe they're related, and they're overlapping in some way. But it's turning into this collection of more or less interconnected, interrelated stories. And it's actually great, because I actually wrote short stories for most of my life. I didn't even attempt a novel until I wrote The Kite Runner.
Well, let's talk about that. You started The Kite Runner as a short story, and you'd been writing short stories since you were 8, right?
Mm-hmm. That's primarily what I wrote. And I always meant to write a novel, and I had written this short story called The Kite Runner sometimes around early 1999. And Roya, my wife, who's in the audience here, she read it. It was sitting in our garage for like 2 years, and she found it and she read it. And I saw her one day on the couch, and she was reading this short story, and she was like kind of weepy-eyed. And I said, "What's going on?" She said, "Oh, this is a really great story. And why didn't you?" So I said, "Yeah, I know, but I don't think it works as a short story." But then I started thinking about it, and I saw that there was in that story the germ for that novel that I had always been meaning to write, that never got around to doing. And so that's how I tried that first novel.
And you did this in the morning before you went to work?
Yeah, I was at Kaiser.
Full-time doctor.
I was at Kaiser on Castro Street in Mountain View. So I had a full-time practice with Kaiser. And Kaiser's great because it's essentially, if you're a primary care provider, it's a 9-to-5 job. So you don't carry a beeper home. You don't admit patients to the hospital. You don't take call overnight. You don't have to be up all night working. It's basically check in at 9, leave at 5, that kind of thing. And so I started getting up early. And to be honest, and the more time has passed since I quit medicine, the more honest I've become about why I began writing that book. At first, I was very polite towards medicine because I would say, well, I did it. But really, the reason I was writing, to me, I felt lost at sea. And the writing was kind of like this life preserver,
How do you mean lost at sea?
Well, medicine was a wrong career for me. I was profoundly unhappy being a doctor. I went into it for reasons that had nothing to do.
You were being a good boy.
I was being a really good boy. I mean, good boy, man. I put many years into that. So I was being a really good boy, and I was the firstborn in my family. My parents were highly trained professionals in Afghanistan. They were, there was a period where we were on food stamps, and they were working these jobs just so we would get an education.
Your mother became a beautician, and your father was
my mom worked
driving.
on Capitol on Tully Road, and my dad taught driving. Eventually became a social worker and so on. But I felt like if I went to them and I said, thanks for your sacrifices, but I kind of want to sit around and pontificate and come up with stories that maybe a couple of cousins will read, and if there's a 1 in a million chance that I'll actually get published. It just seemed to me like so insensible. And I was always like a very, very sensible, level-headed kid, very responsible. So I decided, medicine, I'll never have to be on welfare again. It's a stable job, it's respectable, it'll make my family proud, and I can do it. I have a high threshold for for tolerance, for putting up with things that so I went into it, and I remember the first day of medical practice, I saw my patients, my first day as a full-fledged physician, and it was 5 o'clock and everybody left, and I remember sitting back in that swivel chair and I just kind of looked at the clock and I said, 35 more years, you know? And at that moment, on my first day of work, I knew that I had made a big mistake and that I had started a profession. But I had no other talent. I didn't know what else to do. My wife, I didn't know what I would do. I mean, I've never been a techie.
Even though you'd been writing all these years,
yeah, but
you couldn't identify, you couldn't say, but clearly I'm an artist. You just couldn't say that, huh?
I never took the writing seriously. I mean, I always thought, well, I like to do this thing for myself. I never imagined that anybody would want to read it, let alone, actually, I mean, I felt that people who made a living from writing lived in this entire other dimension, and that didn't belong in the world that I occupied. It just seemed unfathomable. And so, you know, I was prepared to just stay with medicine until I retired. And then this miracle happened, which was that my book was published. And then the bigger miracle was that it was actually read. You know?
Describe the miracle just a little bit, because it's quite a story. You sent this manuscript to many potential agents and were rejected, right?
Yeah, I was rejected. You know, I don't want to make too much of my story, because I think that this is fairly common for people who are trying to get published. There's so many trials and tribulations, and in the grand scheme of things went fairly smoothly for me. But I sent out the manuscript to agencies. What I did was I went to a bookstore and I bought this yearly book that comes out, How to Get Published. So I read that book and I realized that then you have to find an agent. So then I went back to the bookstore and there was this How to Find an Agent book. And so it was a listing for agents. And so I read them very carefully and I diligently sent a few chapters and stuff to various agencies. And I probably went through about 30 agencies. And I got rejected by all of them except for 2. And most of them, I think they had never really read what I sent them. I got these little form rejection slips. A couple did. One of them will stick in my mind forever because it speaks to a much bigger problem that maybe we will address later. But I remember it was June of 2002, and I got this letter from this agency, and they said, we know we really love your book. We think it's great, but we feel that the country has moved on and Afghanistan is passé, and we're looking for Iraq things now. And this was June of 2002, and I kind of said, wait a minute, September 11th was less than a year ago. You know, we went to war there in October, and already it's passé. Wow, Afghanistan's in trouble. So that, to me, was a real wake-up call. But eventually, what happened was I found Elaine, that you spoke to.
Yes, you got an agent, and you got a really huge advance of how much money?
I thought this was going to be a polite conversation. It was enough for me to continue to not buy a new house, but to continue working. But it was a $500,000 advance, which was paid out over.
I thought you got a very small advance.
No, it was a good advance.
There's some misinformation that I got.
No.
I'm glad. I would never have dared ask if I'd known it was so big. I'm glad
when
I
Elaine
didn't know.
called and she said they're offering you $500,000, I almost fell on the floor.
So they really wanted it.
They really wanted it, and it's paid out over a number of years. The way advances work. But I was absolutely astounded, and I remember Roya and I immediately went and found an accountant, and the first question was, can I quit medicine on this advance? I said, can I now go to full-time writing? And he did all the math and everything, and the answer was no. So I said, man, I just got a $500,000 advance, and you know I'm still doing physicals. Okay, I said okay. So I went back to medicine, and I stayed with it. And then what happened was the book came out, and nothing happened with it. You know, it seemed nobody was reading it, and I put so much effort into it, and it was kind of disappointing. It came out to good reviews, but we didn't. You know, it just kind of seemed like it was a come and go. So I stayed and I saw patients. And then what happened is about a year after it was published, suddenly it started appearing in bestseller lists. And what was really happening was that libraries and independent bookstores and book clubs were embracing the novel, telling everybody about it, and sort of this word of mouth built. And next thing I knew, I was sitting at in an airplane next to this lady, and she's reading a copy of my book, and I was just in disbelief.
It's one of the early examples of the book clubs really making a big difference.
Yeah, they made a huge difference for me. They made an enormous difference for me, not just here, but also in the UK.
I'm from Kansas, and my family always went to Minnesota, and my husband and I still go. Our family has a cottage in Minnesota, and the little book clubs up there were all reading it this summer that I read it too. It's a very interesting story.
Then about a year and a half after it was published, I gave this very lovely speech at Kaiser, and I bid them all adieu, and there you go.
And the book is, I mean, all novels in a way are autobiographical, don't you think?
I think so.
And this book, Hassan, for example, you've written that you didn't realize till after you wrote it that you'd used a person that you had known in Iran, who you taught to read and write.
Right.
And that person became Hassan.
Yeah.
Is the house sort of your house in Kabul?
It's the house of my memories, because I have the memories that I have of Kabul, of the house that my father built, where I grew up, was that there's this beautiful, huge house with a massive garden where we had these lavish parties, and they would string lights at night through the trees, and people would have cocktails in the backyard, and there would be live music and this sort of thing. So that was sort of the house of my memories. And so when I wrote The Kite Runner, I was astounded as to how much I remembered and how vivid my memory was and how much I had to tap into. So it literally was just like transporting myself back to being a boy in 1973 in Kabul and putting myself in that time and place. And I felt very much at home writing about that time and place.
And what about the theme? We began to talk about this when we talked about Rostam and Sohrab, but this theme that reappears in all your work, there's a kind of, if you had to name several of the words, there's a betrayal by the older generation. The father lies in this case. In 1,000 Splendid Sons, the father basically gives up the daughter to a wife abuser because he just can't handle it. She's an illegitimate daughter. The shame of Amir because of what he doesn't do for Hassan and what he does do to Hassan, and the secrets divulged, and this is, I can see you've written a screenplay about Sohrab and Rostam and the story, and your new screenplay is about this. Is that also autobiographical? Were there a lot of secrets?
No, but I think it has more to do, and Vikram and I were kind of briefly chatting about it, about this idea of melodrama and growing up on a steady diet of Hindi films and Bollywood movies, was that, I didn't set out to write the book as I did. For me, the story just kind of snowballs. I mean, I know writers who outline everything, and they know the themes that they want to discuss and approach, and then they do it. And for me, it started very, very simple about these two boys who were flying kites. And then as I began writing, I discovered who they were, and the dynamic became more complex, and then the father came into the picture, and I began to see, and as I kept writing, the picture became clearer and clearer and clearer. But in some fashion, I've always been interested in writing about family, and about the ways in which people within a family relate to each other, how they betray each other, how they love each other, how they repel and attract each other. I mean, when you think about it, the relationships you have with the people in your family, especially with your parents and your children, are the most complex relationships probably you're ever going to have. And so I'm very, very attracted to that, probably because, where I grew up, family is such a huge deal in Afghanistan. I mean, especially in that time and era. I mean, we had no television, we had very little radio, there were no computers, there were no video games. I mean, the movie theater played one film for a month, and so when you saw it 6 times, that was that. So basically, the way you existed, the way you conducted your life was with people, with family. So you sat around with your uncles and with your aunts and with your parents, and that's who you interacted with. And so that's a deeply ingrained part of how I was brought up.
And your relationship with your father, however wonderful, was probably quite different than the relationship with your mother. I think I saw something you said once that you have to, it's about respect.
Yeah.
With your father, it's not about love, and you have to earn the respect.
My father was a highly principled, a deeply opinionated man who was uniformly respected. He wasn't a big man in stature, but he was a big man in the way he presented himself and the way he was perceived. I never saw anybody disrespect my father. And he was, in some ways, a slight man. He was thin, but he carried himself in such a way that commanded that he be heard and that he be respected. And it was the same way in the family. He was a very strong and central figure in my life. And, you know, from the time that I was a boy, I loved him deeply. And I always wanted my father to be proud of me, his firstborn. I wanted my father to be pleased with me and to be, and to be happy. When I published my book, it was a great moment of pride for me when my father had a copy of my novel, and I could see he was very happy for me. So I've written about my father in one form or another, in The Kite Runner, a little bit in the second book, a little bit certainly in my screenplays as well. And it's a theme that I seem to be attracted to.
And was your mother telling you stories when you were little? Your mother must be a big part of being a teacher of...
My mother was, and my grandmother was an amazing storyteller. People always say, well, what writers did you inspire? Who inspired you? And I always find that so difficult. I feel like I should say, well, I was inspired by, John Updike, but I wasn't, there are so many writers I admire, but when I'm alone, and I always say, Khaled, you have to come up with an answer to this question. People are going to ask, what writers inspired you? And you should say something that sounds intelligent. But I can never come up with a name, and I can come up with a name, but it won't be truthful. The truth is, I was inspired by people who told me stories when I was a kid.
Yeah.
I was inspired.
Arabian 1001 Nights.
My grandmother, she just told us stories about how when she was a little girl, she went to Hajj. She went to the pilgrimage in Mecca, and the way the ship rocked when she was at the bottom, and she would tell it with such great detail, being in the belly of that ship and seeing these Arabs eat dates with rice, which was unheard of, and she would tell these very vivid details. These were the people that I grew up with. And
thinking about what you were talking with Vikram about, if you're criticized, and you get very good reviews, and I could read some good reviews and some bad reviews, but go on with that. But just believe me that there are some great reviews and there's some mean reviews too. And the mean ones tend to take you to task for being melodramatic. And Vikram has I read an interview that he did where somebody said he was melodramatic, and he said, yeah, that's good. I like being melodramatic. And I think you're not sensitive about it either, right?
I didn't know.
It's part of a storytelling tradition.
Yeah, I don't feel like there's a particular need to apologize for it. You write what you feel, and other people tell you about it. Ultimately, I don't feel there's a need to apologize for telling stories. That's how I grew up. That's the tradition I was raised with. That said, I feel like I am changing as a writer over the years. I'm 45 now. I began writing The Kite Runner. I was about 36 years old. It's a 9-year span, and I feel as a writer, my sensibilities have changed. I'm more trusting of the reader, and I feel like I pay more attention to language and so on and so forth. But that particular charge has never bothered me.
Let's talk about the film of The Kite Runner a little bit. I want to talk about how you worked with David. Is it pronounced Benioff?
Benioff, yes.
Benioff, who was the screenwriter of The Kite Runner. He also wrote films not exactly like The Kite Runner. He wrote the screenplay for Troy, X-Men Origins Wolverine, and a few others. So how did you work with him? I know that he wrote the screenplay, but he was in close touch with you about it.
Yeah.
How did that work, and what were some of the moments when you had to steer him a different way in order to get the story right?
Well, you know,
Or the cultural touches right?
First of all, David's an accomplished writer. I mean, X-Men Wolverine, but he's a fantastic novelist. And if anybody hasn't read his novel City of Thieves, I mean, I really recommend it, and you will feel like you know what the siege of Leningrad was like. I mean, he's a fantastic writer. But he, you know, he works at night, so he starts working around midnight, and he works till about 6 or 7 in the morning, and that's pretty much when I get up to start working. So we have a little bit of time when we overlap, and I would once a week or so I would get up, and there would be an email from David Benioff, and he would say, "What does inshallah mean?" You know, or he would say something like, you know, how would Hassan address the character of Baba? You know, if he were to address him, you know, there would be various questions that had to do with culture, with language, with the locale, with some technical questions about the particular political events and historical events that were going on at that time, because it was the stories around the time when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, so he had some questions about that, and I would just answer him. But I stayed out of his way because I didn't want to wear out my welcome, because I knew what my role was in this thing. I'm not the screenwriter. When the screen comes up, the movie comes up, it's not going to be written by, it's going to be written by David Benioff. And so I knew the game. So it's his movie, so I wanted to be of help to him and let him write his screenplay. You know, I didn't have any illusions that if I insisted on something, that it would actually happen, because I'd been told that in the end, they'll make the movie that they think they want to make. And so,
What did you think of the movie?
I thought it was pretty good. I mean, I didn't think it was a great movie. I think it missed greatness. But I thought it was a pretty good movie. I thought it was quite effective. I felt that the performance of the kids was really charming and very moving, actually. Those were kids. The two boys who played the lead characters in the movie were literally plucked off the streets of Kabul. And we were in China. Most of the film was shot in Western China. And there's a scene where the two boys go to a movie theater to watch The Magnificent Seven. So we're shooting that scene that day, and I was in China with my dad for a couple of weeks. I happened to be there for this scene. And so we walked into this old movie theater in the city of Kashgar in Western China, and these two kids are, you know, they're supposed to be in the scene. They're kind of looking around like this. And I said, you know, what's going on? They're like, wow, so this is what a movie theater looks like. They'd never actually been in a movie theater, so they were in a Hollywood production before they'd actually even seen a movie. So this was how kind of, and for them to then have put on these really kind of, especially the boy who played Hassan, and he won a Critics Circle Award for Best New Child Actor, and I was so happy for him. I thought, and also, you know, the other thing that I think the film was significant for was that it was a film where the entire cast was from that region of the world. Your main protagonist was not typically, it's a Western journalist or some kind of adventure seeker or somebody like that who goes and then has an experience in this foreign environment. No, these were indigenous people.
They spoke
Dari. Dari. They were all Muslim. Mm-hmm. And the point of entry into the story wasn't, you know, political violence. It wasn't terrorism. It wasn't, you know, these characters weren't suicide bombers. They were ordinary people having these fairly ordinary human dramas, as anybody in the West would. And I, given Hollywood's somewhat checkered story about the way they've approached the Middle East, I felt this was a healthy and a positive thing, a positive step forward.
We're going to look at the video in just a minute and talk a bit more about Afghanistan before opening up to your questions. But I do want to ask one question about A Thousand Splendid Suns before we go on. In a way, your two novels are almost a living manifestation of the division of sexes in a place like Afghanistan. The Kite Runner has only Soraya, the wife of Amir, but only in the United States. Women just don't appear in the novel. And then A Thousand Splendid Suns is a novel about women from women's point of view. And how did you do that? How hard was it? And how did you finally get inside their heads so that you could do it? Because you've said that you were actually almost paralyzed for a while.
Yeah, I really was. I mean, it was, writing the second book was so much harder than writing the first book, and for a whole slew of reasons. I remember calling my agent, and we were on the phone, and she was like, so are you finally going to tell me what the second book's about? And finally I said, okay, so it's a story about these two women, and there's going to be two perspectives, and I kind of went through it. And when I was done, there was this long pause, and she said, wow, so you really feel up to this? And I said, yeah, no big deal, and I'll get it done. And then I started writing it, and I was like, what have I done? And Roya here knows I would walk into the kitchen in the morning, and I'd be like, okay, you know what? Where's Kaiser's number? I'm going to call them again. I'm going to go back to medicine, and this is torture, And the second book is hard because, there's the success of the first novel, there's expectations from the public and so on, but really it's expectations from yourself, because there's a part of you that thinks when you're all alone that says, you and I both know you lucked out, that you're a hack, you know and I know, and the rest of the world is about to find out. So write this book, and everybody will know, and then you'll be off the hook, and you can go live in obscurity. And it was so difficult because I kept trying to think like these women, and I kept putting myself in their place. I'd walk to Roya and I'd say, so what would a woman do here? I watched The View, like nothing was helping. And at some point, I got sick of it, and I said, you know what? This isn't working. I'm going to forget about it. If I sound like a man, I sound like a man. I'm just going to get to know my characters, and I'm just going to write them as people, as human beings, and just focus on what it is that they're afraid of, what it is they want, what it is that motivates them, what it is that haunts them. And once I did that, and it seems like a straightforward thing, but Vikram's a novelist, and he'll tell you that the answers to these great problems in the writing of a manuscript turn out to be very simple, but the leap to them is difficult, and you have to go through all these different things to get to that simple answer.
You went down many blind alleys.
Many blind alleys.
Took you 5-6 drafts.
And then at some point, the women began speaking for themselves, and I no longer heard my voice coming out of their mouth, and that's when I felt like the book was finally alive.
The Afghanistan video comes next, but I do want to ask one question before we see it. You returned in 2003, right? Yeah. You returned just before the book was published. And then you've gone back, just before
after the book was published.
Just after the book was published.
Yeah, in 2007, yeah. After the second book.
I mean, you went in 2003.
Oh, yes. My apologies.
Just before
yes.
Kite Runner was published. Then you went back in 2007.
Yes.
And then also last year.
Last September, yeah.
Last September, okay. Now we're going to see a video from the High Commission, for whom Khaled serves as a goodwill envoy. What is a goodwill envoy exactly?
Well, I'm still trying to figure it out, but basically it's my role with the UNHCR is to be an advocate for refugee rights, refugee issues. I have focused now on Afghanistan. It seems a natural fit. And to raise public awareness about the problems faced by refugees, the ongoing struggles that they face since having come back to Afghanistan. And hopefully that will lead to, the awareness will lead to funds, and they will, implement these projects to help the refugees.
Okay, now the video.
In the fall of 2009, I returned to my native Afghanistan as U.S. envoy for the UN Refugee Agency. Since 2002, 5 million Afghan refugees, mostly women and children, have returned to their homeland after decades of war. But their journey home is just the beginning. These families face a daunting prospect of having to rebuild not just their lives, but also their country's future. Addressing the lack of land, shelter, and jobs in Afghanistan is a long-term challenge for Afghans as well as the international community. The UN Refugee Agency's goal is to help refugees return voluntarily, safely, and with dignity. Upon arrival, the agency works to provide shelter, protection, clean water, and assistance to refugee families. The single most pressing need is shelter. During my mission, I visited the village of Beni Warsak in Shamali, an hour outside of Kabul, where I met families living in heartbreaking conditions. This man, Muhammad, lost his leg to a landmine injury during the Civil War. He and his family were displaced during the Taliban era. They settled here in Beni Warsak, a hot, remote, dusty region with no easy access to the main road. Muhammad tells me that there is never enough food for his 10 children. Water is scarce, and there is no school. The small local clinic has almost no medicines, he tells me, and there are no jobs. Worst of all, he and his family suffered through harsh winters with no shelter and no protection from the unforgiving elements. Recently, the UN Refugee Agency provided Muhammad and his family with a permanent shelter. Although his daily life continues to be a struggle, he finds comfort, hope, and dignity in finally having a home. People like Muhammad are the reason why we have to stay committed to Afghanistan. With your support, the UN Refugee Agency can provide other refugees like Muhammad with a permanent shelter. The package includes tools, roofing beams, doors, and windows. The returnees then build their own homes. It is the hope and dream of every Afghan to one day live in peace and prosperity. After my mission, I am convinced that the challenges faced by Afghanistan and the refugees can be overcome, difficult though they may sometimes appear. Together, we can give refugee families the essential resources they need, resources like shelter. We can give them the hope to rebuild their lives in a more prosperous and peaceful Afghanistan. Thank you so much for opening your heart to the people of Afghanistan.
How much of your time would you say you're spending on the job of Special Envoy and also on your own foundation, the foundation that you and your family are raising money for and working on to do some of the same sort of thing as well as others as the High Commission?
Well, my involvement with the UNHCR is episodic throughout the year. So there's 3 or 4 times a year where I get together with them, either on the phone or we meet. We've held last year several fundraisers to help raise funds for the UNHCR. And I've gone on 3 missions with them, 2 to Afghanistan and 1 to Africa. The foundation is fairly a daily involvement because I live with a board member, and the other board member is my sister-in-law, and the other 3 ladies here. So that is hard to say exactly, but in some fashion I'm involved with it every day.
And what do you do exactly in the foundation?
Well, our foundation is essentially a funding foundation. We fund projects through non-governmental organizations that are in Afghanistan, and we target those projects that help the groups that we feel are the most vulnerable. And those are refugees and women and children. And so we've funded the building of permanent shelters for refugees in northern Afghanistan. We built 71 shelters for 71 families in 2009, and we're hoping to double that this year. And we've funded projects that bring education and jobs and opportunity to women and children. And it's been incredible to see. We go to the mailbox every day and we have donations from around the world. We get donations from the UK, from Australia, from the United States, and people care about what happens in Afghanistan, and I'm deeply touched by that.
And inevitably you're going to be asked, and I imagine you may get some questions from the audience too, about what you think of U.S. policy and the surge and various other things happening in Afghanistan. And before I ask you what you think of and whether things have improved at all since you started going back again in 2003, how do you like being considered an expert on Afghanistan? Is this a mantle that fits you, or is it no?
I don't consider myself an expert. I'm a novelist, and I think it's an onerous burden for a novelist to be a representative of a country, and to be. I mean, I realized that once the book came out, suddenly I realized that people want me to be an expert on all things Afghan, and they would ask me about Afghan recipes and things that I had no clue about. I'm a layperson. Any opinion I give on the stage about Afghanistan, U.S. policy, is opinion of a person who reads the paper and who's deeply interested in what happens in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm. And just from what you see, what's your assessment of how things are going?
I think it's undeniable that the situation is going through a rough patch. In some ways, things are worse than they were before. Certainly from the standpoint of security, things have become...
Worse now than in 2003, you mean?
Yeah. Worse now than in 2007 in some ways.
Because the Taliban is strong and more...
Strong. I mean, in 2007, I went to Kabul, and we got into a truck, and we drove all the way to northern Afghanistan, to Mazar and to Kunduz. And that road is now fairly dangerous. And the last time that I went in 2009, they said, you know what, we'd love to take you to these shelters you've built, but we don't want to take the risk because there may be an incident. Those roads have become dangerous. From a security standpoint, I think it's unquestionable that things have gotten more dangerous. But in some other ways, Afghanistan is much better than it was several years ago. In many different ways, it's much better than it was several years ago.
For example, what?
Well, I mean, for many different things. For instance, millions of kids have gone back to school. In early 2002, you had 1 million kids in school. And they were almost exclusively boys. Since then, 7 million have gone back to school. 35% of them are girls. In Afghanistan, people have access to health care now more than they did in the 60s and 70s. 85% of the population has access to health care. Infant mortality has dropped by 25%. Millions of kids have been vaccinated. If you just drive through Kabul, there's amazing enterprise. There's this flourishing commerce, businesses everywhere, and sign that people are getting on with their life. So I think in very real ways, things have improved. For women's rights, for example, the Afghan constitution requires that 25% of the seats in the lower house of the parliament be occupied by women. In the last parliamentary elections, they won 28% of the seats. A quarter of the civil servants are women in Afghanistan, and half the healthcare workers are women. So things have improved in some. And I think only the hardest cynic, and sometimes I think with due respect to the news media, we tend to focus on things that people want to hear. But the fact is that things have improved in significant ways in Afghanistan. That's not to say that the problems that Afghanistan faces today are not very serious, and they are. That's not to negate that. But at the same time, a lot of people have worked very hard in Afghanistan, and I think it's a disservice to them to just dismiss their accomplishments.
And when the surge happened last fall, or early this year, I guess, and the decision was made to send more troops, did you support that, or would you?
I find myself in the uncomfortable position because I'm a pacifist. I find myself in this at a conflict with myself because I did support the surge, and as did many Afghans, including people in Afghanistan. ABC and BBC did a poll last year, and 70% of Afghans support the presence of the troops. 60% of them supported the so-called surge. This is not to say that, inevitably with a surge is going to be more violence. And I firmly believe things in Afghanistan are going to get worse before they get better. And there are going to be civilian casualties. And I'm very sensitive to that. At the same time, it may be, as bad an idea as it may seem to some people to stay in Afghanistan, I think it's a worse idea to leave. Because we have to think about the consequences of what would happen to Afghanistan, to its people, to its women, if the foreign troops were to pack up and leave. And I think it would be catastrophic.
All right, you can see there's a lot to talk about, but it's your turn now. We have about 10 to 15 minutes for audience questions. And please, I guess, stand up and you'll be given a microphone to ask a question of Khaled.
Excuse me. You talk about the improvements that have been made in Afghanistan and that it's doing better in a lot of ways. To what would you attribute that?
What was the last part?
To what would you attribute
Does everybody hear the
the
question?
improvement?
The improvements, and to what does Khaled attribute the improvements?
A lot of people working very hard to make it happen, both expats and nationals. There has been improvement in Afghanistan. As I mentioned, the returning to school, improvements in the healthcare. Afghanistan has relatively free press that is highly critical of the government when it's called for. Afghanistan has a female provincial governor, which is for the first time ever. The Independent Human Rights Commission is led by a woman. I think these are, again, 40% of the voters in these last, albeit flawed, elections in 2009 were women. I think these are significant improvements. The economy is getting better. Technology is booming around the country. In the most remote village where people ride around barefoot or on donkeys, people have cell phones. And, and they ride their donkey 2 hours to the next town and get the cell phone charged, and they come back. And I feel like the country in technology is poised to leapfrog the way in which Afghans conduct business. So I think there's been improvement. Have the improvements gone far enough? Have they gone deep enough? Have they reached as many people as we like? Clearly they haven't. They haven't. A lot of money in Afghanistan hasn't had the desired results for a whole slew of reasons. But there have been improvements. The point is that those improvements can easily be lost. And they can evaporate, I think, fairly quickly if we have a repeat of the scenario that we had in the 1990s, which is Afghanistan fell into the hands of Islamic militants and the militia commanders, and it became an anarchic, chaotic place. And that would be, I think, a great tragedy.
Question?
Hi, I want to step away from global politics and ask about personal politics. Did you get a reaction from any of your family members from your writings where they kind of thought, wow, that was representing me, and you're telling about our lives?
Not really. We never really discussed that, because I think the only character that was clearly based on somebody was Baba, and I had those discussions with my dad. And after he read the book and we sat down, and I think it was in some ways illuminating for him. He goes, "Did you really feel that way about me?" I said, "Well, first of all, this book isn't about you and me. You know that there's lots of things that this Baba character does that have nothing to do with you." But I said that a lot of his honorable traits, I said, are based on you. His politics are based on you. And his politics and mine were so divergent, and he had a good laugh about that. And I said, and he said, "Did you really feel that way when you were a kid? And did you really feel like this?" And I said, "I still do. And as we speak right now, and I'm a middle-aged and I have 2 kids, I still feel that way about you." I think he was very touched by that. But no, I think that's really the only character.
Yes, question?
Have you ever read the novel Caravans by Jay Mitzner, about 40 years ago, about Afghanistan, before it was so widely published?
I read it a long time ago. I haven't reread it. It was quite a while ago. I know the book you're talking about. Caravans, James Mitchell.
We're just waiting for the microphone. Yes.
Hi, so I was wondering, besides donating money, what can we realistically do as undergraduate students, like from Berkeley? Like, what can we do to help your foundation? What can we do to help the country of Afghanistan?
I can't hear anything. I'm sorry.
What can
my question
the
was,
question is, what can undergraduates do to help Afghanistan, right?
Yes, and your foundation.
Oh, thank you. Look, the world is at your hands. You know, this is the world has become so small with the advent of technology that we're all connected and in all sorts of ways. And so, my advice to somebody who wants to help Afghanistan is to learn about it, to read about it, to educate yourself about what people in Afghanistan face. You don't necessarily have to go there. You know, there's so much information out there, and there's so many people who are working in Afghanistan. You don't have to give money. You know, if you can, great. If not, you can give your time. There's, you know, we fund projects in Afghanistan, so we're a funding foundation, but there's plenty of groups that actually have feet on the ground in Afghanistan and can use help. When I went to Afghanistan and in Africa, I was all struck that in virtually every humanitarian office I went to, it was populated by very young people, people who are in the prime of their lives, who should be out driving convertibles or whatever, but they're in these remote, dangerous places at great risk of their own life. And you know, and I'm very, you know, I really admire them for it. So there's a lot you can do. On my website, and the foundation's website, you can learn about the groups that we support. And if there's a project that you really want to get involved with, you can email us. And I also have a list of other organizations that are active in Afghanistan that you can get involved with if you like. But you can send us an email at the foundation, the KhaledHosseinifoundation.org, and we'll get back to you.
Yes, another question.
So what you had to say about your career and the expectations of your parents really resonated with me, you know, as a child of immigrants, and I'm sure many other people in this room. What advice would you give a student who wants to follow their passion and also make a difference in the world and also deal with this cultural baggage and the family network that you value so much also?
No, I understand what you're saying, and it's a tricky thing. But in hindsight, in an ideal world, you would do both. You would follow your passion, and you know, and you would honor your culture, and you would honor your family, and everybody would be happy. You know, in my case, it kind of worked out that way. It's almost unbelievable because my passion was writing, and I found myself in a position, in a rarefied, very amazing position to actually make a living doing something I was doing anyway and that I've always loved doing. And it brought me closer to Afghanistan. It opened this door for me to help the people in my country and hopefully make a difference for them. And it was something that my family respected a great deal. But you know, it doesn't always work out that way. What your passion may not be exactly what your parents have in mind for you. At the end of the day, having worked for 8 years, and honestly, I don't mean to slam medicine. It's an amazing profession. It's an honorable profession. And I have a great deal of respect for it and doctors. It just wasn't for me. But having worked in a field where I felt so ill-suited for, my advice is do something you love. You only live once. And there's boundless happiness to be had from getting up in the morning and knowing that you're going to do something you really love doing. You never question why you're alive. You never question why you're getting up. It just, the amount of happiness that this thing has brought to me is immeasurable. And ultimately, it's your life, and you have to follow your dreams. It sounds like this cliche that you see in like B-grade Hollywood films, you know, like follow your heart. But you know what? There's I think wisdom in that.
I think we have time for one more question. Would you say, Dave? Right here.
I was wondering if you could elaborate on the education in the refugee camps and just kind of how your foundation works to provide education for the children there and how the schools are set up and how they're educated and things like that.
The refugees that we work with are actually, I should call them returnees. They no longer live in refugee camps. The camps are outside of Afghanistan. They're in Pakistan and Iran. We support refugees who've come back to Afghanistan, so they're now returnees, and they're trying to reintegrate into society and trying to refit into Afghan society. But the UNHCR that we fund, now I should go back. UNHCR has a shelter program and a whole slew of other programs to help refugees who've come back to Afghanistan. We support the shelter element of that, but UNHCR also is involved in bringing education, helping build schools and bringing in teachers to help educate returnees in Afghanistan. Through our foundation, we've funded groups that build schools for girls, that train teachers, that provide school supplies in areas where it's really, really needed. Just 2 weeks ago, I think it was, we were in Diablo, right? It was in Diablo, and we helped fund the building of a school for girls about an hour outside of Kabul. And so we're funding, we've done our research, and we're interested in helping people that have very little overhead and who have feet on the ground in Afghanistan. And we are funding people whose results we have seen and that we've become very impressed with. And so that is really one of, besides the shelters for refugees, education is something that I feel very strongly about, and something we'll continue to support. We're also providing scholarships for girls in Kabul to attend the American University, which is the only private university in Kabul. And so we're paying for tuition for young women to become university educated. And that's a program that we hope to expand as well in the future.
I want to thank all of you for coming. It's wonderful to see you here tonight, and please join me in thanking Khaled Hosseini.
Thank you.